Hello, and welcome to the second lecture for the Empire, Society, and Modernity Civilization class for Year 2 students. I'm Marc Calvini Lefebvre, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the Great Famine of 1845. That's going to be my starting point. The perspectives I'll be bringing to it are colonial history, economic history, and political history. In order to follow this lecture, you need to download the presentation from Ametis. So if you turn to the first slide, you'll find a map on the left-hand side, which is very colorful, as well as two tables. Let's have a look at the map first. The map shows you the decline of Ireland's population over a 10-year period between 1841 and 1851. And if you look at the key for the map on the left, you'll see it's a color-coded key, and it shows you that the population fell by between 1 and 30 and more than 30% all over the country, except in 3 areas that are in green. Those 3 green areas are the only ones in which the population grew, and all 3 of them are centered on large towns. Belfast in the northeast, Dublin in the middle there, and Cork in the southeast. As you can see from the first table at the top, there was a steep decline in the number of Irish men and women in Ireland between 41 and 51 to the tune of roughly almost 2 million people. But as you can also see, if you go down the chart and you move on to 1871, you see that the decline in population continued after 1851. And that to this day, so the latest numbers I have are for 2017, Ireland still hasn't recovered the population numbers it had in the middle of the 19th century. Okay. What is it that caused this collapse in the population? Well, two things happened. 1.6 million people died, and 1.3 million people left the country, emigrated to avoid death. Why were people dying? Well, the immediate cause is what was called the potato blight, and I have a picture on my slide of a very ugly looking potato, which is ugly because it is being eaten up by this disease called blight. That disease devastated the potato crops in Ireland in 3 consecutive years, 1845, 1846, and 1847. The problem is that the potato was the staple food, that is to say the basic food that the immense majority of Irish people ate. 3 million people of the 8.2 million that you have on the first table, 3 million of them were totally dependent on the potato for survival, and another 3 million were deeply dependent on it. So that's 6 million people who need the potato. Half of them cannot survive without it, and the other half will have a very difficult time surviving without it. So, because the blight ruined the potato crops, this caused a famine, and the famine itself led to people dying, but many of them did not die of starvation, but died of diseases caused by the starvation, such as dysentery and cholera. And of course, because people were terrified that they would die of hunger, a lot of them tried to leave the country, to emigrate. Now, it's important to understand that Ireland was not the only country suffering from famine in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. In fact, the entire decade of the 1840s was nicknamed the Hungry Forties because everywhere in Europe there were problems with food because of the potato blight, which was a disease that was spreading throughout the continent. And so all countries were affected to some degree. However, if you look at the second table there, which compares the different countries, what you notice is that of the 4 countries that are represented, all of them see their population growth slow down or stagnate. But only Ireland saw a successive decrease in every single year of the period, and at levels that are well above, I mean considerably above, those of the other countries, including Holland, which is the only one that sees a population, which is the only other one that sees a population loss. The other thing you notice is that only Ireland sees a population decrease continue after the Hungry Forties, because you can see that the final column is about the period between 1850 and 1860, and you see that all the countries that we're talking about see a population increase, except Ireland, which continues to see a population decrease. So the question we're asking ourselves today is, why was the situation so much worse in Ireland during the Hungry Forties? To understand the catastrophe, I'm going to start like I did with the Great Reform Act by taking a step back, and we're going to look at 3 things. First, the effects of English colonization on Irish society. Second, the reforms that Ireland had gone through before the famine of 1845. And finally, thirdly, we will look at something called liberal political economy, which was a way of understanding the world, which began to rise in Britain before 1845 and would play a crucial role in the way the authorities responded to the crisis in Ireland. So let's turn to the background. And we begin with this idea that Ireland was a typical colonial society. There are 3 points I'm going to make here. The first is I'm going to ask, why do states colonize other places, other states, or other lands? Secondly, we'll look at how this is done. And thirdly, we'll see what the result was. So let's turn to the next slide, which has a number of characters on it, as well as 2 maps. Ireland was colonized entirely by England under the Tudors in the 16th century. Why were the Tudors, who you can see up here, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, why were they keen on colonizing Ireland? Because Henry VIII initiated a transformation of his country by separating England from the rest of Europe and declaring it to no longer be under the rule of the Pope in religious terms. And under his successors, particularly under Elizabeth I, the idea that England was a Protestant nation was affirmed. But the island of Ireland, which is just next door, remained a Catholic land. And so the Protestant rulers in England became concerned that France or Spain, which were the 2 Catholic superpowers of the time,
might use this Irish Catholic country, which was so close to theirs, as a base from which to attack the island of Great Britain. So the reason why people in London decided to send troops over to Ireland to conquer the island was first and foremost a question of security as they perceived it. But there was also a second motivation, which was that from a Protestant perspective, Catholic Ireland was inferior, uncivilized, because of course the Protestants believed that their form of religious belief was superior to the Catholic belief. And so successive rulers of England justified the subjection of Ireland not simply for security reasons, but also on the grounds that the Irish were somehow less sophisticated, less civilized than the Protestants in Great Britain. So after the Tudor period came James I, who you see at the bottom of the slide there. He's in between Elizabeth on his right and Oliver Cromwell on his left. Under James I, and then under Oliver Cromwell, who was not a king, but a sort of military dictator. It's a long story that I don't have time to go into, but he comes to power after the Civil War in the United Kingdom. Under them, under their rulership, English and Scottish Protestants were encouraged to go and settle in Ireland. And the name that was given to the settlements that they created was plantations. So those of you who are familiar with imperial history will perhaps recognize a term that we usually associate with the colonization of the Caribbean. But it was in fact used here in this first instance in Ireland. So they called these plantations. And you have an example of a plantation on the top right-hand corner of the slide. What you see there is a drawing. It's not actually a drawing of a plantation. It's a drawing of a military encampment outside of the plantation. So it's both. Now, I don't know about you, but usually when something needs to be defended by a military camp, it's probably a sign that that thing is not necessarily secure. And why were these plantations not secure? Why were they under threat? They were under threat because the land that the Protestants were given, the Protestants who came over from England or Scotland to settle in Ireland, that land was expropriated from Catholics. Okay, so that brings me to the next slide, slide number 7, which asks the question, how? So we know why they wanted to colonize. They wanted to colonize for security reasons, but also they said to civilize Ireland. But how did they do it? Well, the first thing they did was to confiscate the land. Okay, so basically Ireland, like most countries in Europe at this time, was functioning on a feudal system where a small group of people at the top of society were concentrated most of the land of the country and were owners of the land. And what the English and Scottish, well, the English rulers did is that they confiscated the land of the Catholic elite in Ireland and gave it to the Protestants who were migrating to Ireland. So, as you can see on the slide, in 1641, 60% of the land in Ireland is owned by Catholics, but by 1660, that is down to 9%. So there's been a massive shift of ownership away from Catholics and towards Protestants. Okay? Now, I'm sure you can imagine that this does not go down very well with the Catholics. Of course, the Catholic elites aren't happy because it's their land that's being taken away, but the other Catholics who didn't own the land are also quite shocked that all this land is going to these Protestant migrants. So their response is often one of anger, and when you have an angry population, one way of keeping it under control is to use the force of the law and of the police and of the courts, or of the police or other forms of armed units. And so between the 16th and the 18th century, so over a 200-year period, the authorities, the British Crown, passed what were called penal laws. So there's a series of these laws that recur over time, and they are focused on three areas in particular: laws that concern land ownership, laws that concern political power, and laws that concern the way religion is organized on the island of Ireland. Okay? So, as you can see from the slide, the effect of the laws is to give Protestants a quasi-monopoly on land and a total monopoly on Irish politics. So let's go through them one by one. If we look at land first, if you're a Catholic, you can't buy land. Okay? So any land that becomes available on the market is restricted to Protestant buyers. But let's say you're a Catholic who already owns land, who has not been expropriated. The law says that when you die, your property must be divided between all of your children. Now, the result of doing that, of course, is that it weakens the strength of each Catholic owner, because if you have usually these were large families, and so if there's 1 acre of land, but you divide it by 10 children, each of these children has some land, but a lot less than their father, and so they are a much weaker owner than before. Okay? So this diminishes the power of Catholic landowners. In politics, the law explicitly says Catholics cannot occupy any public functions in Ireland, and Catholics cannot vote for the Irish Parliament or take part in it. Now, just an aside here, there is an Irish Parliament because Ireland is, of course, governed from London by the government in London, but there is this Parliament that is consulted by the government in London. Okay, and so what the law says is that if you're a Catholic in Ireland, you can't vote for this Parliament, which means, of course, that this Parliament is elected by a tiny group, a minority group, the Protestants. Okay, and they are the only ones who can sit in this Parliament. On the third front, religion, the law is also very clear. The hierarchy of the Catholic Church, so the archbishops and the bishops, which are the typical in the pyramid that is the Catholic hierarchy with the Pope at the top, and then you've got the archbishops, the bishops, the priests, etc. That hierarchy is banned on the island of Ireland. But to add insult to injury, the Anglican Church of Ireland, that is to say, the Protestant Church of Ireland, is the established church on that island. So most people are Catholic, but the official church of their island is a Protestant church, and everyone, be they Catholic or Protestant, must pay tithes. Tithes are a tax. They're called tithes because they are 1/10 of the annual produce of a farmer. Most people are farmers in Ireland, the crushing majority. And the idea is that 1/10 of what they produce must be given to the church. of Ireland, the Anglican Church of Ireland. So you're a Catholic. Not only must your church, your Catholic Church, not be organized in the way a Catholic Church normally is, but on top of that, you have to pay a tax to the other church, the Protestant Church, to keep it running. Okay? So, as you can see, these laws, and of course the strong men who are then used to punish people who don't obey those laws, create a society that is deeply unfair. Okay? And it's a society that is absolutely typical of what we know to be the colonial system. So let's turn to the next slide to discuss that. There are many ways in which societies, colonial societies, can function. There's many different types of colonial society. It's a bit absurd to say that all colonial societies are the same. That is certainly not what I want to say. But what I do want to say today and highlight for you is the fact that colonial societies, on the whole, have a number of similar characteristics, which I have boiled down to six. Six characteristics that strike me as typical of a colonial society that we find in the Irish case. So let's have a look at these. The first characteristic of a colonial society is that there's permanent minority rule. Okay? So in a typical colonial society, because it's a colony, there is a majority of people who are from that colony and a minority who were brought in as settlers. Okay? But it's the minority which has power. Okay? So in this case, we have 10% of the population which is given privileged treatment over the majority. In Ireland, this is given a name. People called it the Protestant ascendancy. Okay? Ascendancy meaning a form of domination. Now, the Protestants' position, the position of this 10% of the population, is entirely dependent on the support they get from the imperial center. If they don't get support from London, their power will rapidly erode. And so the imperial center is always very suspicious of what this minority wants and does, because they know that this minority depends on them for support, and so they don't want them to get too carried away and ask for too much. So they give them power, but not too much, because they don't want them to get carried away and either ask for too much or, worse still, ask for independence. So the Irish Parliament, in which you have elected Protestants, has no power at all until 1783, something I will come back to later. Okay. Second typical characteristic of a colonial society, the systematic institutional bias of the institutions in favor of the minority. So we've already seen this in the previous slide. The law is not applied in the same way when it comes to Catholics and Protestants. The people are not equal in front of the law. Quite the contrary. The goal of the law is to protect the interests of the minority against the majority. The police or army are also there to protect the minority and its interests against the majority. And finally, the religion of the minority is given prominence over the religion of the majority. Okay, so there's a systematic institutional bias. All the institutions favor the minority. A third typical characteristic of a colonial system is that the colony's economy is underdeveloped. Why is it underdeveloped? Because it's the development that is allowed is development that serves the interest of the imperial center. Okay? So typically, like a lot of colonies, Ireland in this period was seen by the centre in London as a granary for Great Britain. Okay, so the primary sources produced by the colony, in this case, wheat and potatoes and agricultural products, not potatoes, wheat and other agricultural products, these were seen as primary resources that could be taken by Britain and exported to Britain to feed and nourish Great Britain, the imperial center. In such economies, we have a number of vicious circles that are created. First of all, in the colony, there is a rich minority, right? The minority that we talked about, the Protestants, they own the land. Okay? On the land, the food is grown and then exported. So they make money off of their ownership of the land that they can rent to Catholic farmers who are not allowed to own land and who will produce goods that are then sold. So the owners, the Protestant owners, they make money off of the land that they have, that is protected by the law, that nobody can take from them, that they can only accumulate more land by buying land off of Catholics who are not allowed to buy, but who are allowed to sell. And so there is no incentive for these Protestant landowners to try to improve the quality of the farming that happens on their land or anything like that, because their wealth is assured. In French, we would say ils ont une rente. Okay, so there's no effort to be made to improve the situation. Okay, and so by the time I'm talking about, which is the beginning of the 19th century, most of these people who have tremendous amounts of money and wealth have left Ireland because for them it's not a sufficiently developed place. What they are interested in is, of course, mingling with the elites in Great Britain. So they send their children there for schooling. They live there themselves in order to be closer to the centers of power and the centers of wealth. So they are called absentee landlords because they own the land, but they're not actually living in the country. Okay, and that's going to be important for the questions around the famine. So what are the consequences for Ireland of all of this? Well, one consequence is that the best Irish crops were exported because they were too expensive for ordinary people to buy anyway, and because London saw Irish production as destined for Great Britain. But secondly, English and Scottish landlords make their money essentially from renting. The first result is that this will slow industrial development because it's in nobody's interest to put a factory on their land. Much better to just keep renting it to farmers. So agriculture is the dominant sector of activity, with about 70% of the population working in fields. The second result is that when landlords feel like they're not getting enough money from people who rent their land, they would just kick the person out. They would evict them, evict the tenant, and find somebody else, because there's so many people looking for a place to work that it's not that difficult. There's a lot of pressure to rent, and so you just kick somebody out who's not paying enough and bring somebody else in. This creates tremendous amounts of social insecurity, of course, because people are always worried they're going to lose their house. And finally, final consequence, Catholic farmers discovered that they can make more money by subletting, donc sous-louer, than by trying to make the most money from working the farm. So what you have to picture is there's a Protestant landowner who will rent, I don't know, let's say 1 acre of land to a farmer, an Irish farmer, and this farmer will then split that acre of land into smaller parcels that he in turn will sublet to other farmers, because renting land is actually more productive of wealth than growing crops. The result of that is that by 1841, most agricultural plots are very small. They're less than 5 acres. And that's why everybody grew potatoes, because 1 acre of potatoes gives you as much food for a family of 8 as 2 acres of wheat. So that's why potatoes become this massive, widespread production, because it's the best way to feed large families, which are typical at the time. Okay, so let's move to the next slide to see the following consequences. So we had the first 3. I told you there's a total of 6. So slide number 9. Fourth consequence and fourth characteristic of a typical colonial society is that you have regular cycles of community-based violence, obviously in a system that is so deeply unfair and where you have such a large group of people being mostly dominated and crushed by a small group of people. This creates cycles of violence. So the oppressed majority will regularly engage in acts of resistance. So there were gangs, tough guys, Catholic gangs called the Defenders, who would attack Protestant landlords or the representatives of Protestant landlords when these landlords or their representatives evicted Catholics from their homes. So because they felt this was deeply unfair, that this Catholic had been evicted, they would then bring together a bunch of strong men with bats or other forms of weaponry and go and beat somebody up. Okay. Catholic farmers would also engage in forms of resistance by refusing to pay tithes. Now remember, tithes is a tax that you pay on the. It's not money. It's you pay in kind, en nature. So you have to give parts of your production over to the Church of Ireland. And so some of the Catholic farmers would maim their cattle, for instance. If they had to give a cow up, they would injure the cow so that the Church of Ireland could not sell the cow and make money off of it. Okay? But of course, such acts of resistance were brutally punished by the authorities and by minority vigilantes. This is this is a word used in English, the vigilante. As you can see from the French, we would say être vigilant, but in this case, it's not so much être vigilant que être un vigile. That is to say, a vigilante is somebody who is not authorized by the state to use violence, but they use violence in the name of what they think is the public good without having been authorized to do so. A recent example of a vigilante is what happened in the USA, in the city of Kenosha, where a 17-year-old boy, I should say, went to this city with a rifle or a shotgun and shot at least one person dead during the riots in Kenosha on the grounds that he thought it was his job as a 17-year-old to do the work of the police because the police were not doing the job sufficiently well. Okay? That's what a vigilante is. So here, Protestant groups called Peep a Day Boys, I'm not sure why they were called that, but that was their name. They would fight the Catholic gangs, and the local police, of course, supported those Protestant gangs, and they would go around and arrest or kill farmers who were resisting paying tithes. Sometimes things got so out of control that London would send in the army. And to do that, they would pass laws in London called coercion acts, which basically were acts of parliament that said, so long as there is disorder in Ireland, the normal rules do not apply anymore. So they suspended things like habeas corpus, which is a law that says you must be brought before a judge if you are arrested, so you know what you are being tried for. They would suspend that, so anybody could be arrested with no reason given and no judge to see them. This was a way to stop the leaders of the rebellions, and to crack down on majority unrest. Okay. A fifth characteristic of these colonial societies is the constant symbolic violence that is exercised against the majority. So there is this physical violence, of course, that we've talked about, but perhaps just as bad, if not worse, is the symbolic violence. So what is symbolic violence? It's violence that you face when you are repeatedly told that you are inferior to somebody else and that this inferiority is natural, right? If you are told constantly that people, let's say you're somebody with brown eyes like me, if you're told all the time that brown-eyed people are less intelligent than blue-eyed people, you might come to believe it, right? And that's a form of symbolic violence, because this is a way of justifying the superiority of blue-eyed people over brown-eyed people, by claiming that it's natural, that it comes from nature. Okay? So the goal of such symbolic violence is always to justify the rule of those who are said to be superior, okay, by saying that it is not, basically it's a way of concealing the idea that the truth, rather, it's a way of concealing the truth. The truth is that the people in power are in power because they're the ones with the guns. But this symbolic violence, the goal of it is to say that's not true. It's not because of the guns. It's because we are naturally superior to you. It is necessary for us to rule because we are naturally superior. It's got nothing to do with violence and coercion. And what form does this symbolic violence take? Well, it takes the form of the cartoons you see on the right of the slide, which constantly portray Catholics and the Irish as superstitious, lazy, drunk, violent, and as animals. Okay, so you see this very well in those two posters. On the right at the top, you see a man and a woman being attacked by an Irish supposedly an Irish nationalist, but what it doesn't look like a man. It looks like a monster, right? And underneath you see the lion representing, of course, Great Britain, speaking to a monkey, and the monkey is Ireland. Okay. I just want to add before I move on that this symbolic violence is not only exercised by the government or by the newspapers, it's in the air people breathe at the time. It's a sort of constant language of belittling the Irish. And to give you just a quote, a historian who should have perhaps known better, a man who was a historian at the University of Cambridge, so quite an intelligent man, a man called Charles Kingsley, wrote a letter to his wife in 1860 where he said, he was traveling in Ireland, and he said, "I am haunted by the human chimpanzees I saw along that 100 miles of horrible country. To see white chimpanzees is dreadful. If they were black, one would not see it so much, but their skins, except where tanned by exposure, are as white as ours." So you can see the dehumanization that takes place in this process of symbolic violence towards the Irish. Okay, let's turn to slide number 10 for the final characteristic of a typical colonial society that we find in Ireland. And that is that in such societies, the discontent of the majority, ends up becoming politicized. And that is how Irish nationalism was born. In Ireland, both Catholic and Protestant Irish people, both rich and poor Irish people, became resentful of the way in which the imperial centre was ruling Ireland. And this led them to become allies in a movement called Irish nationalism. Now, like all movements, Irish nationalism is complex, and there's a lot of different branches and a lot of different positions. But I think we can narrow down the essence of Irish nationalism into two core beliefs, and they then are materialized into three different strands. So the two core beliefs are, as you can see on the slide, first the idea that there is an unwritten law, une loi non écrite. According to Irish nationalists, above and beyond the laws that the British government has made, there is an unwritten law that says the land of Ireland is for the Irish. Okay? So on that ground, direct imperial rule from London is simply illegitimate. They can make all the laws they want. At the end of the day, Irish land is for Irish people, so there's no reason for them to decide. Second core belief, the legitimacy of this Irish nationalism derives from the people, not from an institution like a parliament. So it doesn't matter what the Parliament of Dublin says. What matters is what ordinary people say. Of course, the problem for the Irish nationalists is that you can say that you derive your authority from the people. The problem is you have to then define who the people are. And for the Irish nationalists, this is a real question. Are we going to say that the people of Ireland means everybody born in Ireland? Or do we think that the people in Ireland means only the Catholics in Ireland, which would mean you would exclude the Protestants? Or are we saying that the people in Ireland means the people who believe in Irish nationalism, and then you're going to exclude people who are born Irish but do not want to see an independent Ireland? They want to stay members of the United Kingdom. Okay? So those two core beliefs then are translated into three political strands. The first strand, the first approach, is a constitutional one. That is to say, there are Irish nationalists who want to stay in the Union with Great Britain, but they want autonomy in the Union. Okay? And this autonomy they want to achieve through peaceful methods. What they call at the time moral force. La force morale, pas la force physique. The second strand of Irish nationalism is militant. They don't want autonomy, they want independence. And they don't want to use moral force, they want to use physical force. Okay? Be careful, militant in English is what the French call un faux ami. On ne parle pas de militantisme ici au sens de j'ai ma carte dans un parti politique. On parle de militantisme ici, ce que ça veut dire, c'est de l'action violente. Okay? And finally, the cultural strand of Irish nationalism says that what they want to do is they want to emphasize the specificities of Irishness. So you know that in Ireland there is the Celtic language, there's also Celtic sports. I don't know if you've ever seen a game of Celtic football, but it's not the same as what other people call what other people call football or soccer in the USA. And they want to really make a distinction between what it means to be Irish and what it means to be British. And so this cultural nationalism is not always translated into a political movement, but it's certainly translated into an active sort of social movement which wants people to speak Celtic to play Celtic sports, to cook Celtic food, etc., etc. Kind of like you have in other parts of the world, like in Provence. We have people in Provence who would like in Provence for people to speak Provençal. They don't necessarily want Provence to be independent of France, but they do want a sort of revival of Provençal culture. Okay? So that is Irish society as a typical colonial society. And what we're going to see now is how that society was under pressure to reform itself. So the typical colonial society that I have presented was under pressure to reform, and I'm going to discuss this, as you can see on slide 11, in three chronological steps. We're going to look at three moments where pressure to reform was articulated. First, in the 18th century, we'll look at how Irish Protestant leaders from the Irish Parliament attempted to put pressure on London to obtain change for all Irish people. Then there's a second moment at the beginning of the 19th century where Daniel O'Connell becomes the major leader of the Catholic movement in Ireland that demands change, but demands change always using constitutional, peaceful methods. And by the middle of the century, there's a young, up-and-coming Protestant nationalist leadership that is dissatisfied with O'Connell's methods and results and wants to try and obtain quicker, faster, and more radical results with quicker, faster, more radical methods. So let's begin. Slide 12, we're talking, as you can see, about Grattan's Parliament. So London was under pressure from the Protestant elite, and the pressure that was put on London led to a number of rules and laws that were passed that made things a little easier on the Catholic majority. So Henry Grattan, who was a political figure in Dublin, under a parliament that he dominated, where he was the main figure, campaigned for an autonomous Irish parliament. So they wanted the Irish parliament to have more power, but within the UK. His methods were constitutional. He didn't try to use violence to achieve his ends. What he wanted was to get autonomy within the Union. And he believed very strongly in what was called Catholic emancipation. That is to say, the right for Catholics to have political to have political power. That is to say, the right to vote and the right to sit in Parliament. And he famously said, "The Irish Protestant can never be free until the Irish Catholic has ceased to be a slave." So as you can see, he's got a very strong idea about the fate that Catholics are suffering under London's rule. So both the Westminster Parliament and the Irish Parliament tried to find solutions for Catholic grievances. So on the question of land, remember there were 3 points: land, politics, and religion. On the question of land, Catholics were allowed to own land on the same terms as Protestants from 1782, and in terms of politics, Catholics could vote and accede to civil and military posts in Ireland from 1793. But as you can see, nobody focused on, or changed, the issue of religion. Right? So that's an important marker there, I think. Unfortunately for the Irish Protestant leadership in the Parliament in Dublin, the French Revolution ruined everything all over again, because the French Revolution created an appetite for violent insurrection, an appetite that an Irishman called Theobald Tone was prepared to endorse. And so in 1791, he created something called the Society of United Irishmen, which was a secret society, the goal of which was to unite, as you can see on the slide, unite the people of Ireland, abolish the memory of all past dissensions, and substitute the common name of Irishmen in place of the denominations of Protestant, Catholic, and Dissenters. So Theobald Tone has this idea that what counts is that you're Irish, not what religion you are. And what counts is that your Irishness makes you different from the British. And so what you need to do is get rid of the British. So he wants an independent Irish republic. He doesn't want to have a monarch anymore, just like the French did. They got rid of their monarch. He wants a republic, like the French have a republic. And like the French, who have rallied around the idea of being French, of a French nation, he wants the Irish to rally around the idea of a French nation. And of course, the French revolutionaries are very happy to help him, so they give him troops. They give him support. Not a big support, but a number of troops to go and attack the British in Ireland. And so 1,000 French soldiers land with him in Ireland, and they are defeated. Okay, but of course the existence of this action by Theobald Tone is going to have consequences, because as a result, if you turn to slide 13, you'll see, as a result of his initiative, the British government again becomes worried that the French, in whatever regime they are under, whether it's the Republican regime or the imperial regime of Napoleon, that the French will use Ireland, again, we're back to this concern, to invade Britain. And so, in order to make sure that Britain's security is guaranteed, the Westminster Parliament and the Westminster government will propose to the Irish Parliament that the Irish Parliament should disappear, but in exchange, Irish Catholics would be emancipated, that is to say, they could vote for Westminster elections. So remember, the Catholics were allowed to take part in Irish politics, right, since 1793. What they are being told now is Irish politics are going to disappear, so you won't be able to take part in that, but if you agree to dissolve your parliament, we will let you vote in ours. So that's what happened, almost. As you can see from the slide, the Irish Parliament was indeed dissolved, but the King of England said, I can't accept Catholic emancipation, because if I accept it, it would contradict my oath to uphold Protestantism. Remember that the Protestant king is the head of the Church of England, of the Anglican Church. It is his responsibility. He swears an oath to protect it. And so he said, I can't protect the Church of England if I give the vote to Catholics. So the Irish Catholics lost the political rights they had gained in 1793. They lost them in this deal. As you can guess, and as you can see from the next slide, slide 14, this result did not go down well with the Catholic community. Daniel O'Connell became the voice of that community. So O'Connell is a very interesting character. He was a wealthy Irish landowner, and he was a barrister. That means he worked in the law. And his goal was to obtain civil and political rights for Catholics with the return of a parliament in Dublin, but of course remaining in the UK. He's not interested in Irish independence, okay? And he wants to achieve his goals peacefully. He's not somebody who wants a violent revolution. His methods are, as says on the slide, constitutional. Okay, they remain within the Constitution. So there's three big movements he leads throughout his career. The first one is the Catholic Association. So he creates this in 1823, and it's created explicitly to obtain Catholic emancipation. This Catholic Association is using a new technique, a new approach to recruiting members, and that is to have a very low entrance fee. So you have to pay 1 penny a month to be a member of the association, and so that makes it affordable for poor peasants. The critics of this say, he's making people pay a so-called Catholic rent. They tried to mock it by calling it Catholic rent. But the result was that if you raise 1 penny from a lot of members, very quickly you have a lot of money. And so they had a weekly budget of £1,000. What did they do with that? Well, they used it to organize mass meetings, and they would successfully deploy this mass pressure strategy of open air meetings in a series of events that would push the Westminster Parliament towards Catholic emancipation. What the trigger allowing them to get what they wanted was the decision by the Tory government that I talked about last week, the decision by the Tory government to repeal the Test and Corporations Act. So you will remember that the Test and Corporations Acts were acts that said people who are not Anglican Protestants cannot become members of Parliament or members of the government or members of the House of Lords. What the Tory government decided to do was to get rid of those acts, but only for other Protestants, so Protestants who are not Anglican. This was felt by Catholics to be deeply unfair and unjust. And so Daniel O'Connell seized an opportunity because the following year in the county in Ireland called County Clare, there was a by-election. A by-election is when a member of Parliament either dies or resigns from his seat, or is promoted to minister, and so you need somebody else to represent the seat. So there's an election only in that county. It's not elections everywhere, just in that county. And Daniel O'Connell decided to run in that election. Now, O'Connell won the election, but because the Test and Corporations Act said you can't sit in Parliament if you are a Catholic, he could not take his seat. There was so much anger in Ireland that the government was afraid there would be a civil war. So the Tory government decided to force the hand of the king and obtain Catholic emancipation. And so the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, presented or threatened the king with his resignation if the king did not pass the bill into law. And so he did. And so they obtained Catholic emancipation in 1829. There were 3 limits on that emancipation, however, that are important. I've only put 2 in the table, but the third one is in the notes underneath. The first limit was that no Catholic could become a monarch, or a Lord Chancellor, or a Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And also that now, in Ireland, although Catholics could now vote, it was only Catholics who had at least £10 of wealth in the property qualification. Okay, so this is a question of how much money you earn per week, per year, depending on the qualification. But basically, there's a wealth barrier that you need to meet. Sorry, why? Because that way the Tory government was excluding Catholic peasants from the vote. And the third proviso that I have not put on my slide is that Daniel O'Connell had to rerun to get the seat. He had to run again to get the seat, and interestingly, he won the seat anyway. Okay? So having had this success, he launched in 1830, right? So he won in 1829. The following year, he launched a tithe war against the rent, the tithe tax that we've talked about. So Catholics in his association, which remember is a mass association, they refused to pay tithes between 1830 and 1834. For 4 years, they refused to pay tithes. And this created huge tensions with the local authorities and a constant headache for the government in London. In order to avoid civil unrest, the government tried to appease Catholic grievances with two measures. First, the Tithe Commutation Act, which basically said, okay, we're getting rid of tithes. You no longer have to give 10% of your crop or of your production to the Church of England of Ireland. Sorry. All you need to do is now pay a single tax, a money tax. Everybody has to pay the same, but it's relatively low. So you're still paying a tax, but you're no longer paying in kind. Okay? And perhaps more importantly, they passed the Marriage Act in 1836, which recognized all marriages in nonconformist chapels and in Roman Catholic churches. So in the United Kingdom at this time, unlike in France today, in France today, when you get married, you don't have to go to the church. What you have to do is go to the town hall, la mairie. You must get married in the town hall. That's how your marriage becomes legal. In the UK at this time, the only way a marriage is legal is if you marry in an Anglican church. So this change is important because it means that people who are not Anglicans can get married in their churches and have that marriage recognized. So another success for Daniel O'Connell. So O'Connell started a third campaign in 1840 after this success, creating something called the National Repeal Association. He had become convinced after these almost 20 years of campaigning, he had become convinced that only an Irish parliament could legislate for Ireland. So he wanted to repeal the Act of Union, which had dissolved the Irish parliament. Again, this did not mean that he wanted independence. He just wanted a legislative body for Irish affairs. And so once again, he turned to his preferred method, which was mass pressure. In 1843, 100,000 people, that's a lot of people, even by today's standards, it's quite a lot of people to get together, but 100,000 at the time is huge. 100,000 people came to listen to him in a place called Tara, and this was symbolically important because Tara is a site that is associated with Irish kings. So there was this sort of symbolic meeting which sort of gave this impression of wanting, almost Irish independence, even though if that was not his goal. But unlike the previous two big movements he led, this one was not feared by the London government. The people in London decided that they've had enough of O'Connell and they weren't afraid of civil war anymore. So they decided to ban his next meeting. He was supposed to have another meeting in Clontarf a few days later, and the people who wanted to participate in the meeting were threatened with imprisonment. And here you see who or what kind of politician O'Connell was. O'Connell wasn't prepared to risk either the life or the well-being of the people who followed him. He did not want them to be imprisoned. He didn't want himself to find himself in difficulty, but he wanted to avoid also death. He was afraid that there would be bloodshed if he went ahead with his meeting. He was afraid that another 100,000 people would show up and that the British government would send the troops and that this would get ugly fast. So he called off the meeting, which was a great disappointment to many of his followers, and he was arrested by the authorities. He was fined, and he was jailed. 4 years later, in 1847, Daniel O'Connell died. at the height of the Irish famine. Okay, so this formidable leader, Daniel O'Connell, was succeeded by a group of young Protestant men, and this takes us to slide 15, who called themselves Young Ireland. So their movement is very visible and active between 1842 and 1848. And it makes its announcement or its appearance on the scene, but with the publication of a journal called, or newspaper I should say, sorry, called The Nation. The first issue of The Nation appears in 1842, and what it does is announce a different program to O'Connell's. It says, first of all, that what they want is independence. No more of this autonomy stuff. We want independence. Secondly, Britain's relation to Ireland, they say, is not a productive one, or it's not one or it cannot be one, sorry, that's federal, like O'Connell wants. He wants there to be different parliaments in different parts of the country with a single king at the top. They say, no, this is not a federal relationship. This is an imperial relationship. The government in London is dominating us. We need to get rid of this empire. So unlike O'Connell, their vision of Irish nationality is a romantic one. They ground their vision of Ireland in Ireland's mythic past, not in Ireland's Catholic majority, which is what O'Connell does. They think that by doing that, you can transcend the differences between Protestants and Catholics, which of course O'Connell has a harder time doing because his goal is to mobilize the Catholic majority. And finally, they want to distance themselves from O'Connell in the methods they use because they want to use physical force, not material force, not moral force, sorry, not moral force. Okay, so these are massive differences. And of course, because they are much more belligerent and because they want independence, the way they are portrayed by the British press, as you can see, is as dangerous monkeys. So if you turn to slide 16, there is a summary there of Ireland before 1845. What do we see? We see that Ireland before 1845 is a country that is, although deeply colonial, also rapidly reforming. And the vestiges of the colonial past are being lifted, particularly regarding the civil and political oppression of the Catholic majority. However, the changes to the political and legal status of the Catholics has not changed at least three things. First, the economic underdevelopment of the country and the subordination of the economy to the needs of Great Britain. Second, the established nature of the Church of Ireland, it's still there. And third, the condescending attitude of Great Britain towards Ireland and the Irish. So, that is the background for Ireland. Let's now cross the Irish Sea and look at what the background before 1845 is of Great Britain. And here I want to talk about, and this is the next slide, slide 17, about the rise of what was called liberal political economy in Britain. So we'll see this in 3 points. First of all, the ideas and supporters of liberal political economy, and then 2 laws that were the direct result of those people. The New Poor Law of 1834 and the Anti-Corn Law League in 1838. So first of all, what is liberal political economy? So this is slide 18. You can trace the inheritance of the liberal political economy to 2 names, 2 big thinkers of the 18th century, Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham. Adam Smith is famous for a book called The Wealth of Nations, and in it he talks about the invisible hand of the market. The point about his invisible hand idea is simply that the wealth of a country is not produced by the state. The state doesn't produce anything, and state intervention in the economy is actually counterproductive. The name given to state intervention in the economy at the time is mercantilism. It's the name of the policy of state intervention. And what the state does is it picks the best industries to flourish. So if you take the example of France, in France we have somebody called Colbert, and le Colbertisme, as it was called, is a form of mercantilism. That is to say, Colbert would say, okay, we need to have a silk industry in France, and so he would protect the people who make silk in France by putting huge taxes on the people who make silk elsewhere to stop them from selling their silk in France, so that the silk makers in France would have a captive market in the French market and would therefore develop their industry. Okay? So Smith says that's the wrong way to do it. The right way to do it is to take the government out of the economy and have a politics of what is called laissez-faire. That is to say, let people do what they want. And if you let them do what they want, they will be innovative and creative. They will create new products that people will want, of good quality, that people will want to buy, and this will create a virtuous circle of enrichment where everybody will get richer. So he talks about the invisible hand because he says there's the visible hand of the state that intervenes, but that one you want to get rid of. There's the invisible hand of all of us looking after our own interests, leading to this positive outcome that because I want you to buy my bread, I'm going to make efforts to make it better than the bread that is sold by somebody else, better and cheaper. And as a result, everybody benefits. You get better quality bread for a lower price, and I become wealthy. Okay? So that's Adam Smith. Jeremy Bentham, in his Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, says two things. He says, first of all, that humans are not so complicated. Actually, humans are pretty simple. There's two things that guide their actions. On the one hand, they want pleasure, and on the other hand, they want to avoid pain. Okay, those are the two basic things that drive all of us. And he says, if you think about that, if you take that as your starting point, then politics is not that complicated either. What you want in politics is you want the greatest happiness principle to apply. That is to say, you know you're doing a good job if your policy increases the pleasure, the happiness of a majority of people. Okay? So those are the two sort of main origins of this liberal political economy. The core ideas that are derived from them, as you can see, there are four. The first one is this idea that the economy is like nature. It obeys laws. Okay? And if you've ever done an economics class, you know that in economics, there's something called the law of supply and demand, in French, l'offre et la demande. That is to say, if I sell something, if I sell you a loaf of bread, if I sell my loaf of bread 10 euros, that's the supply, I'm not going to find anybody to buy it because the demand for bread, even though it's high, is not for 10 euro loaves of bread, because the other loaves of bread you can buy, which are perhaps just as good, are much cheaper than that. So my supply has to meet the expectations of the demand, and the demand has to be sufficient for my supply to be sold. Okay? And so for these people, for these liberal political economists, the economy is like nature. The laws of the economy are like the laws of nature. Just like if I take a pen and I drop it, if I let it go, it will fall to the ground because of the law of gravity. In the same way, if I want to sell on the market, I need to obey the laws of supply and demand. If demand is high and supply is limited, I can sell my loaf of bread 10 euros. But if supply is large and demand is smaller, then I have to bring down my prices for the demand to pick up on my loaf of bread. Second point, second core idea of liberal political economy: to interfere in the economy is to disrupt the natural or divine order with negative economic, social, and political consequences. So the idea is, don't meddle, because if you have a human interference in this natural economic order, you're going to cause problems. Okay, and that's going to be very important for the for the Great Famine of 1845. Third consequence, if you follow the laws of economy, these laws that they say exist, you will have prosperity, you will have social harmony, you will have political stability, and you will have international peace. Okay, so it's a very ambitious vision for the world. Finally, they believe that everyone can improve his or her condition in a free economy if they show self-discipline, thrift, and hard work. So if you're a hardworking person, if you're disciplined, and if you are careful with your money, to be thrifty is to be careful with your money, to manage your money carefully, not to spend it on ridiculous things, then you can improve your condition. So who supported this vision? Well, you have supporters in the upper middle class, because the people in the upper middle class want to end state intervention because they want to trade internationally. They are the ones who own the factories, who own the businesses that produce things, and they want their production to be sold abroad. The working classes are also interested in these ideas because the promise of this liberal political economy is to make things cheaper. And the working class is living on very low wages. And what they would like to see is the price of food go down in particular. And this is the promise of liberal political economy. Okay? So let's see how the people who were defending these ideas, translated them into policies and movements. So first, let's look at this New Poor Law of 1834, because it's the reason I'm talking about it is, of course, because it's going to have consequences also for the Great Famine. So before I explain what the New Poor Law was, let me just explain what the poor laws were in general. So these had been in existence since the 17th century, and the idea was that in each parish you were responsible for organizing relief for the poor in the county that you were in, that the parish was in, la paroisse in French, through the collection of a tax. So basically, people living in the county would have to pay a tax called the poor rate, and the money they paid would go to the parish, and the parish would use this money to help the poor. Okay? And there were three categories of poor: the impotent poor, the able-bodied poor, and the idle poor. So the impotent poor were the people who couldn't work. So people who were poor, but who there was no way they could make any money because they were somehow physically disabled or too old. Then there were the able-bodied poor, that is to say, those who could work, their body was sufficiently functioning for them to work, but they couldn't find any work. So you help them because they're currently without work and can't find any. And then there was a third category that people called the idle poor, and they claimed that those people refused to work. So I'm sure you can see that the idle poor were not very popular, and they were the ones that were often the targets for very negative social views. In the 18th century, there was a change in the way in which poor relief took place. In some parishes, they decided to build something called a workhouse. And the idea was the people who didn't have a job, the people who were poor, would be forced to live in these workhouses if they couldn't find any work. So those people would get what was called indoor relief, that is to say they get help, support, indoors inside the workhouses. And then, in other parishes, they began using the rates, the poor rates, to supplement the low wages of workers. So you do have a job, but you're not getting enough. So you go ask for help, and you get what is called outdoor relief. And that leads to depressed wages. Now, depressed wages doesn't mean that the wages are going through a depression in the sense that wages don't have feelings. Wages are les salaires. But depressed wages means that your salary is lowered by your boss because your boss knows that you're going to get a compliment from the parish. By the 19th century, things are getting out of control. The number of poor in and out of work has become too important. The poor rates keep increasing because the taxes to help the poor keep going up. By 1830, we're talking about £8 million. And in 1830-31, you have the swing riots that I talked about last time, which are partly a result of these people's unhappiness about poor relief. So the Whigs come to power at this point. They're the ones who made the Great Reform Act that I talked about last week. They come to power, and their analysis is, well, the system we have is economically inefficient, and it encourages laziness. So what we need to do is come up with a new law, a new poor law. So they devised the new poor law of 1834. The main architect is a fanatic called Edwin Chadwick. Edwin Chadwick is a fanatic of the liberal political economy, and he says that his law will be, quote, like a cold bath, unpleasant in contemplation, but invigorating in its effects. So he says, right, nobody likes to have a cold bath, but it does you good when you have one. And so we're going to do that with this new poor law. So what does he do? First of all, he abolishes outdoor relief because he doesn't want bosses to bring down the salary so that you can then go and get a little top up from the parish. He then adds that all poor people must move into workhouses. Okay, if you're poor, even if you have a job, if you're too poor, you have to go into the workhouses. And he adds, because that's the kind of nice guy he is, that all workhouses must be super unpleasant. The idea is, if life in the poorhouse is miserable, that's going to make you want to get the hell out, and you will, as he sees it, take personal responsibility for your life. So basically, he wants to punish the poor for being poor because he thinks that they're poor because they're lazy. Naturally, in the 19th century, not everybody is so cold-hearted as Edwin Chadwick, and the law was denounced and criticized for being cruel. It was seen as epitomizing the dark side of this liberal rationality. Okay, and I'm sure those of you who are interested in literature know that one of the main critics of these workhouses was, of course, Charles Dickens. Okay, so that's the new poor law, which will come in handy for us later on when we talk about the Hungry 40s. Let's look now at a movement that was born of the liberal political economy position, which is the Anti-Corn Law League. So this is slide number 20. Let's have a quick flashback on the context. In 1815, remember, Waterloo, Napoleon is defeated. There is now peace. Napoleon's armies, or Napoleon's conflict with the British had Napoleon had orchestrated a blockade, un blocus, ce qu'il appelait le blocus continental. So he had orchestrated a blockade to stop European ports from trading with his enemy in the United Kingdom. With his defeat, the blockade ended. So now, products from Europe could come to London, could come to the UK. Okay? In addition to that, British agriculture at the time was in surplus. So, there's too much agricultural products in Britain. There's all this additional agricultural products coming from Europe into the UK. What does that do? Well, according to the law of supply and demand, there's too much supply, not enough demand, prices go down, some farmers go bankrupt. And some big farmers decide to lay off workers, so there's more unemployment. The Tory government, which is in power, decides to introduce something called the Corn Laws. These laws say, first of all, you can't import wheat from Europe until wheat from Britain has reached a very high price. Okay, so they want to depress supply, bring down supply, so that the prices of the wheat go up. Okay? Why do they want to do that? They want to do that because this will protect agricultural jobs, but of course it's also going to protect agricultural profits. Who are the winners of this? Well, the farmers are the winners because they keep their jobs, but the biggest winners are the landowners, the aristocrats who own the land because their profits for all this don't go down. The losers in this game are the urban workers because the people who live in cities and who work in factories, they see the price of bread go up and stay artificially high because there's no competition on the wheat market. And if there's a bad harvest year in Britain, because you have to wait for the price of British wheat to go up very high, this means that the wheat from other countries doesn't come in fast enough, and so not only are prices high, but also there's not enough to go around. This is the context for the creation of the Anti-Corn Law League. The founders are the two guys you see there on the right of the slide, Richard Cobden, who was a factory owner from Manchester, and John Bright, who was a cotton manufacturer from Rochdale. So let's turn to slide 21, where we see what the Anti-Corn Law League methods and arguments were, and also what response they got from their opponents. So first of all, their methods. They used newspapers and pamphlets for their propaganda. So they had a weekly newspaper called the Anti-Bread Tax Circular, and they had leaflets and pamphlets. So on the one hand, they're sending out paper propaganda. On the other, they're holding mass meetings like Daniel O'Connell did. So they have big indoor meetings in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester with 8,000 people, for instance. And in London in 1843, they had 136 meetings in the year. Fundraising, so they raise money through bazaars and tea parties, and petitions to Parliament, which they send, as well as getting MPs elected to Parliament, 12 MPs by 1845. And that, of course, is crucial, because if you have MPs, that means you have people in the center of power who can directly defend your case in Parliament. It doesn't mean you're going to win the argument, but it means your argument gets heard, and that helps you convince other MPs. What are their 6 arguments? Every one of those arguments is articulated around the idea that tariffs, that is to say, taxes on food coming or products coming in or products going out, les tarifs, les taxes sur les importations et les exportations. 6 arguments against tariffs. First of all, they say tariffs are immoral because when you have tariffs on stuff coming in, it starves the poor. The poor can't buy bread because it's too expensive. But also tariffs are unfair because what they do is they protect the strong in the British economy and they harm the weak. They're also, thirdly, unnatural because the tariffs are products of human intervention in the economy, and this distorts the natural working of the economy. If you remove the tariffs, the strongest British farmers, the ones who have the best prices and the best wheat, they will stay in business. The others will collapse because they're just not good enough. And this will mean that farmers who are more efficient in Europe will be successful in the British markets, and that will be good for British consumers. Fourthly, they say these tariffs are bad because they kill innovation. If British farmers had to compete with foreign farmers, with French farmers, German farmers, Russian farmers, etc., they would have to improve the quality and the quantity of their production. Fifthly, the tariffs are accused of killing trade. If Britain imported more foreign grain, foreigners would import more British goods. This is the conviction that they have, that if you open your barriers to trade, then the other side will open too, and there's more trade going through. I let all of you think about that in the context of the Brexit negotiations. That is exactly what is at stake in the Brexit discussions. Finally, the 6th argument is that the tariffs are encouraging war. They think that the more trade takes place between countries, the less likely they're going to go to war. Because if you and I, if our two economies are deeply, deeply interconnected, what is my interest in starting a war with you? I'm going to lose a lot of money. and I'm going to lose a lot of wealth and a lot of connections. Whereas if my society and your society are ignorant of one another and we're not connected to each other economically, I don't risk very much in bombing the hell out of you, and vice versa. Finally, let's turn to the response from the protectionists and the Chartists. So those who oppose the Anti-Corn Law League. On the one hand, you have the protectionists who say that tariffs are good because they protect social cohesion. If you had cheap foreign wheat, the countryside will become empty because everybody there will lose their job. They will all become unemployed and they will be forced to move to the cities. Furthermore, tariffs are good because national sovereignty over food would be lost without these tariffs. If you bring the tariffs down, then European wheat will become the principal thing that is sold in Britain. This means the British no longer control the source of their food. If tomorrow there's a war with France, then all of a sudden Britain, which will no longer have a functioning agricultural sector, would find itself starved. That's the fear. And finally, middle class bosses, this is the Chartist argument. The Chartists see the middle class bosses as just wanting to have cheaper bread, make cheaper bread, because that way, if bread is cheaper, they can justify paying their workers less, because their workers say, look, boss, I need a higher salary because bread is so expensive. But if the bread goes down, the boss can say, look, bread is cheap now, so I'm going to bring your wages down. Okay? So that brings me to the final slide of this first long section looking at Ireland and Britain before 1845, to say that for Britain, before 1845, you have a very vigorous liberal movement that is associated with the spirit of reform, that has at this point used liberal ideas to reform poor relief, and is pushing to transform economic policy, to move from mercantilism to laissez-faire. The Anti-Corn Law League has 12 members of parliament, a very efficient propaganda machine of newspapers and public speakers, a vast working class following, and the support of Daniel O'Connell and his movement. Its opponents are most landowners, the Times, and Tory members of parliament. In 1846, the Anti-Corn Law League triumphed over its opponents. But this wasn't because it managed to convince people rationally that laissez-faire was better. It was because of the Great Irish Famine. And as it says on the slide, unfortunately, the triumph of the Anti-Corn Law League and of laissez-faire did not save the Irish. Having developed at length the background to the Great Famine of 45, it's time now to zero in on the event and to look particularly at the response of the British government to the Irish famine. So this takes us to slide 23, where, as you can see, I divide this discussion into two sections, one on Prime Minister Robert Peel and the second on his successor, John Russell. So, Robert Peel, who is in charge of things in 1845, is faced with the following situation. As you can see on slide 25, the problem he is confronted with is that there are major crop failures in Ireland, but also in Scotland and England. So there's crop failures everywhere. Peel puts forward three solutions. The first one is that he's going to continue to see Ireland as Great Britain's granary. So he's going to continue exporting Irish grain, despite the fact that people in Ireland were starving. So that's going to be a problem, of course. The second thing he's going to do is he's going to organize emergency relief in Ireland. So that's going to take three forms. First, he's going to buy cheap American maize and distribute it to the Irish. Secondly, He's going to organize and subsidize public works to keep people in employment so that they have some kind of income to buy food with. And finally, he's going to create a relief commission that is the job of which will be to centralize the questions of relief to the Irish people. But the most consequential thing he will do, the most important thing he's going to do, is to repeal the Corn Laws. Now, Robert Peel is a conservative. And so, or a Tory at the time, they're not called conservatives. So when he does that, his party is divided. Those who continue to be protectionists or mercantilists, who are led by Benjamin Disraeli, a name that is important and that you will meet again. We talked about him last week. We'll probably talk about him again. And that's about 2/3 of the members of Parliament behind Disraeli are going to oppose this repeal. And the Peelites in the Tory party, in which you find Gladstone, another big name that we talked about last week and we'll talk about again. Within the party, after 5 months of bitter debates, in May 1846, the bill passed the House of Commons thanks to the support of the Whig opposition. This had two sets of consequences. Politically speaking, because Peel no longer had the support of a majority of his own party, he had to resign. But in resigning, he and the Peelites, that is to say the people who supported him, left the Tory party and joined the other side, the Whigs, who would become the Liberal Party very quickly afterwards. These Whigs would become now the party of government, and the Tories would be out of power for a very long time. They would not return to power until 1866 under their new name of the Conservative Party. Economically, what were the consequences of this repeal of the Corn Laws? Well, they were not really what the liberal political economists had said they would be. They said that prices of wheat would fall, but they didn't fall because the harvests continued to be bad everywhere. And Irish farmers continued to sell their production to Britain to be able to pay for the rent of their homes and therefore avoid eviction. So if they're continuing to sell, that means there's not enough wheat in Ireland to feed the Irish. Okay? So Peel has to step down. He's replaced by John Russell. That takes us to slides 26 and 27. So John Russell, as Prime Minister, decides to hand over the power to oversee the relief in Ireland to a man called Charles Trevelyan. And Trevelyan is somebody who has some pretty strong views, again, views that you might consider slightly cold-hearted, in that he sees the famine as God's punishment on the Irish. He sees the famine as a sort of biblical plague that has fallen on the Irish. And why are the Irish being punished? Because according to him, they are backward. They're not civilized enough. He also thinks, like many politicians will tell you this, that a crisis is the best moment to act because it's a moment where you can make things change. And so he sees this terrible crisis as an opportunity. He says, look, this is great. We're going to finally be able to modernize Irish agriculture. And how do you do that? Well, you need to force the bad landowners, the ones who never do anything to improve the yield of their land, and who just are content to get the rent from the land, kick them out, force them to sell their property to people who would invest in agriculture and make it profitable. So that's his starting point. Trevelyan continued some of Peel's policy, so he continued to export Irish grain to Great Britain. He also continued the public works, and this is where things get a bit absurd, really. There was a policy of making people create roads that went nowhere. So there's a picture on my slide there called Famine Roads in Ireland Today. And these are roads that go up the hill, but then they just stop. So you can see them there. There's just roads going up, but they just abruptly stop because the people just stop digging, right? They stop making the road. And the idea was to get these people to work in this way, this ridiculous way, for no objective, if only to be able to say, look, they did something so we can give them some money. Okay, and they were earning enough, as you can see, to buy 6 potatoes a day. Right? And as you can also see, those relief works, those public works, involved 700,000 people in 1847. That's a lot of people making useless roads. A third policy of Peel's that he continued to pursue was what was called direct relief. That is to say, 3 million people were being fed directly in soup kitchens around the country. But the other thing he did was adopt rigorous laissez-faire approach. That is to say, from August 1847, he said the British government should no longer be responsible for intervening in the economy to pay for poor relief. Poor relief should be taken on by Irish taxpayers, people who pay the rate. Now, who are the Irish ratepayers? Well, they're the rich people who own Irish land. But if they have to pay higher taxes, they need to find the money. So what they would do is they would evict the people on their land who weren't paying enough in order to be able to charge more for rent. So one of the vicious cycles that is generated by this decision is that it forces people out of their homes into the street, and they're already hungry. Imagine what the result is. Well, the results were, of course, that millions of people died, millions of people left, and there was deep political resentment towards England. But the population was also extremely weak. So when there was the People's Spring, le Printemps des Peuples, in 1848, all over Europe, where there were revolutions everywhere in Europe, in Ireland, the Young Ireland movement tried to cause an insurrection based on all the resentment people had, but the movement was so weak that they were crushed and that their leaders were sent off to Australia. As I told you last week, going to Australia at the time was the one-way ticket to Australia was to break the law for political reasons. That's how you went to Australia. But I don't think anybody did it at the time in the hope of a pleasant journey to a beautiful country. They were, of course, not so happy to be sent to this place, which was a penal colony. So, as you can see, I've tried to show you how the background, the long history of Ireland gets crystallized into this moment where the liberal political economic principles of this rising Whig party comes directly to bear, is brought directly to bear on this island, which has been colonized and which was slowly reforming, but was still very much treated as a dependent colony on the empire. So what are the legacies then of the Great Famine of 1845? There's 2 sets of legacies I want to discuss. As you can see on slide 28, I want to talk on the one hand of the advent of the free trade nation, and on the other of the persistence of the Irish question. So let's begin with the advent of the free trade nation. This is slide 30. After the repeal of the Corn Laws, which, as we saw, was caused by the Great Famine, because Peel thought that if he could get rid of the Corn Laws, he would bring the price of wheat down for the Irish. The idea of free trade becomes the new economic orthodoxy. So it used to be mercantilism and protectionism, it becomes free trade. The 2 big parties, Whig and Tory, and then Liberal and Conservative, both supported. Even Disraeli, who was against the repeal of the Corn Laws, ends up being in favor of free trade. So in 1849, the Navigations Acts are repealed. That means that all the restrictions on trade between British colonies and the rest of the world are removed. In the past, before 1849, if you were a British colony, you could only trade with Britain. After 1849, you can trade with anyone in the world. Gladstone, remember him? He was a supporter of Peel. When he becomes Prime Minister, or before being Prime Minister, when he's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Ministre des Finances, he's the principal architect of expanding free trade throughout the century. He's in government very often Gladstone is during the 19th century. And every time he's in government, he does something to bring down tariffs. In 1860, Cobden, remember he's one of the founders of the Anti-Corn Law League, he was responsible for developing a free trade deal with France. It's a pity he's not around to help Boris Johnson at the moment. The working classes, as you can see from the slide, supported this big economic change because between the 1850s, so after the Hungry 40s, and the 1870s, so there's a sort of 20-year period there, where there's a boosting economy, a booming economy, thanks to this liberalization of trade, and the prices come down. So the working classes benefit from this. But there are people who are not happy about this. There's two challenges. One is a campaign for what is called fair trade, which, as you can see, is towards the end of the century. It's a campaign that says foreigners, other countries, are cheating. They're basically producing goods in ways that undercut British workers and British factories and British companies unfairly. This is an argument you still hear today. When people say la délocalisation c'est pas bien, parce que les entreprises à l'étranger n'ont pas les mêmes standards de santé et de conditions de travail pour leurs travailleurs que nous. Et donc, en ayant des travailleurs qui travaillent dans des conditions bien moins bonnes, qu'ils peuvent donc payer bien moins bien, ils produisent des choses qui ensuite font perdre leur travail à des travailleurs français qui, eux, ne peuvent pas être payés aussi mal que des travailleurs dans d'autres pays et donc sont plus chers. Mais ils sont plus chers pour de bonnes raisons, c'est-à-dire que nous avons des critères de santé au travail qui sont meilleurs, etc. Okay, so it's that idea, the fair trade idea. And then at the very end of the century, in the beginning of the 20th century, the campaign for tariff reform, where the conservative politician Joseph Chamberlain will lead a campaign to introduce what he calls imperial preference, which is to say that he wants tariffs to exist between Britain's partners, between Britain, and its economic partners that are not in the empire. He basically wants the empire to be a big free trade zone, but the rest of the world should have to pay tariffs to enter that zone. So that's very much what contemporary Brexit politicians are talking about. They want to do the same thing with the former imperial power, the former imperial members of the empire, the former members of the empire, like Australia or New Zealand. They want to make big deals with them rather than be part of the European trading market, the European common market. But these two campaigns were defeated by the laissez-faire people because each time there was a campaign for tariffs, to return to tariffs, they always said, look, in the 40s, we had the tariffs and everybody was hungry. And they also insisted that if you have protectionism, this will create conflict with your partners. So the result of this repeal of the Corn Laws caused by the context of the famine was that Britain appeared throughout the 19th century as a liberal beacon. A beacon, c'est un phare in Europe, in both economics and politics. Okay, and as a result of this view of Britain, it was very hard for the Irish nationalists to get the rest of the world to understand that England was actually not liberal when it came to Ireland. That when it came to Ireland, England was not a liberal power, but an oppressive power. So that brings me to my final point, which is the persistence of the Irish question. So the legacy of 1845 is not only that Britain is transformed into this sort of champion of liberal ideas in economics and politics, but also that the Irish question will not go away. And there's three dimensions to this Irish question. The first dimension is this group called the Fenians. Now, who are these people? If you turn to slide 32, you'll find out. The founders of the Fenians call themselves the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and they were created in New York. Now remember, these are people who fled from Ireland during the Great Famine. They end up in New York, and when they're there, they create a group of that they call the Republican Brotherhood. And they also call themselves Fenians because that's a reference to ancient Irish warriors. Okay, so it's sort of a mythic reference. Now, of course, if they're comparing themselves to warriors, it's because they're prepared to use violence. So their core beliefs are three. First, that British liberalism is a disguise for British self-interest. So when the British say, yes, we're in favor of liberalism, economic liberalism, political liberalism, what they're really saying is, we're in favor of that because that's what's going to help us win. And so they take the Irish famine as an example of this. They say, look, the Irish famine, the British used the excuse of the Irish famine to, for instance, roll back the corn laws, and they said this is good for everyone, but in fact it was only good for them. The Irish continued to starve, and the British economy boomed. Their second core belief, is that reconciliation with Britain is impossible, and therefore that the only way for the Irish to be free is to get rid of the British, but this time without anybody's help. Don't call on the French, don't call on the Spanish, don't call on anyone, do it yourself. In 1867, they engaged in a number of actions to try to achieve that goal. So, first of all, they tried to get uprisings in Ireland, right? But these uprisings were crushed by the British Army, and as you can see in my parentheses there, the British government was so worried about Ireland that they had more soldiers in Ireland than they did in India. That tells you something about what they're afraid of. Remember, if you compare the size of Ireland to the size of India, you'll see what I mean. India is huge, Ireland's tiny, but they have more soldiers there because they're afraid of what could happen there. In Manchester in 1867, 2 Fenians were rescued from a prison van by their colleagues, and in the context of that escape, 1 policeman was killed. The result was that the police hunted them down, found 3 men found the 3 men and hanged them. These men were then immediately transformed by the Fenian movement into what were called the Manchester Martyrs. Finally, in 1867, in the jail of Clerkenwell, 12 people died and hundreds were wounded when the Fenians tried to bomb the jail and failed. So what were the consequences of these actions? Well, on the one hand, they made Gladstone, in particular, aware that there was a problem to be solved. And so when he became Prime Minister, he declared, my mission is to pacify Ireland. To try to pacify Ireland, he passed laws. In 1869, he decided to disestablish the Church of Ireland. So that's really important. Remember, that means that the Church of Ireland, which is an Anglican church, is no longer the official Church of Ireland, a country that has a huge majority of Catholics and very few, there's a minority, but it's a real minority of Anglican Protestants. So he abolished tithes, and he decided that the wealth of the Church of Ireland would be taken away and used to improve the hospitals, the workhouses, and the schools. That's quite a big, ambitious policy. In 1870, he went further and introduced the Land Act. In that act, it was said that Irish tenants would now be compensated if they were unjustly evicted. And a just eviction was defined as an eviction that is the result of somebody failing to pay the rent. So you can't be evicted for any reason, which is what they used to do. If you pay your rent, nobody can evict you. They can't just evict you because they decide they want to raise the rent, and so they get rid of you to get somebody else in. But unfortunately, that particular Land Act wasn't very successful because what the landlords did was they just increased the rent to force evictions, causing more violence, causing Gladstone to have to use the Coercion Acts again in 1871. The other consequence, in addition to Gladstone acting, is that the Fenians developed a whole culture around the idea of martyrdom, and they continued to try and achieve their ends through violent actions. And in 1882, a horrible thing happened. A terrorist group who were not the Fenians, who called themselves the Invincibles, murdered the Secretary of State and the permanent Undersecretary in Dublin in a park called Phoenix Park. And this led, of course, to the huge unpopularity, at least in Britain, of the Fenians and their actions. So that's the first strand. That's the first way in which the Irish question doesn't go away. There's a very small but very mobilized and very resolute terrorist organization and terrorist actions. The second strand, which you see on slide 33, is a much more peaceful strand of Irish nationalism. It's the campaign for Home Rule. So here, unlike the Fenians, you've got a series of politicians who are trying to achieve change in a peaceful way. So the first one that we meet, and you can see it in my table here, from 1870 to 1879, you've got a guy called Isaac Butt. So unfortunately for him, not a great last name. Isaac Butt, founder of the Home Government Association, is trying, for what he wants is to keep Ireland within the United Kingdom, but like Daniel O'Connell, he thinks the Irish should govern themselves through a parliament in Dublin. Now, because he uses only peaceful methods, nobody pays attention to him at all. So nothing happens. He's got no government responses, no results. In 1879, he is succeeded and replaced by a man called Charles Parnell, who everybody recognizes, who recognized at the time, but recognizes also today, as one of the most talented and one of the most skillful politicians of his time. Parnell took an approach that was much more belligerent. He didn't use violence, but he engaged in pressure, mass pressure, just like O'Connell had done. So in 1879, he launched what he called the Land War. And he declared, Ireland is not a geographical fragment of England. She is a nation. So what did the Land War mean, and what did the Irish Land League do? That he created it. He said the goal of the Irish Land League is to focus on what he calls the 3 F's for Irish farmers. So a fair rent. So he wants people to be paid a fair rent. Fixity of tenure. That is to say, you can't have arbitrary evictions, because when you are a tenant, you're a tenant, let's say, for 5 years. And for 5 years, nothing can happen to you. And after 5 years, you renegotiate. And the third F was freedom of sale. Tenants should be able to lease where they are at market price. So those 3 F's, they don't appear on my table, but they appear in the notes underneath the table on the slides that you've downloaded from Amétis. So what did the government do in response to his land war? They introduced a bill to compensate Irish tenants. But that bill was defeated by the House of Lords. At which point, the Irish Land League decided to boycott the people who came to evict tenants. So the first person to experience this was precisely a man called Captain Boycott. That's why it's called a boycott. So what happened? Captain Boycott was a landlord, or was an employee of a landlord, and his job was to kick people out. So he kicked somebody out of one of the homes owned by his landlord, his employer. But after he had done that, nobody would talk to him. Nobody would serve him in shops. Nobody would express anything, would speak to him at all. Nobody would interact with him. That's where the expression to boycott comes from. So this happened to him, but it happened to a whole bunch of people. Faced with that, the government managed to pass the Land Act. So what were the results? The 3 F's that they had been calling for were granted by the government. But this didn't stop the Irish nationalists. They continued the land war to force Home Rule. Home Rule is the idea that you have your own parliament in Dublin. And faced with this continued pressure, Gladstone felt he had no other choice but to imprison Parnell and other nationalist leaders. Okay, so this first tug of war is largely a victory for Parnell. 3 years later, the Irish MPs decided they no longer would support Gladstone because they felt he wasn't giving them what they wanted, and they switched their support to the Conservatives. Their reward for doing this was that Lord Ashbourne, who was the Conservative, passed an act which provided £5 million for loans to Irish tenants so they could buy the land they were renting from the landlords. So that's an extremely generous policy. And over the following 6 years, 25,000 Irish farmers took advantage of this offer. Okay, and bought the land. In 1886, the nationalists switched back to the Liberals. The Liberals introduced a Home Rule Bill, but this Home Rule Bill was defeated in the Commons. And it was defeated because the Conservatives said, if you give Home Rule to Ireland, it will not be Home Rule, it will be Rome Rule. That is to say, the Catholics will dominate and the Protestants in Ireland will suffer. This was what they said. They made an argument about how the Protestants in Ireland would become the victims of the Catholics. So the Conservatives were against it, but so were the Radicals. So the Radicals are to the left of the Liberals, but they feared that the union between Ireland and the UK and Great Britain, would be dissolved. Okay. So Gladstone tried again in 1893. He still had the support of the Irish nationalists. He tried again a Home Rule Bill, and he was again defeated. The problem is that the idea of Home Rule was so deeply implanted in Ireland and the electorate that the Conservatives realized they needed to find a way to defeat it, and they thought we can do it, as Lord Salisbury said, by killing Home Rule with kindness. So they thought we can get rid of Home Rule if we are more generous than we've ever been. And so they passed another Land Act, which was led by a man called Wyndham, which allowed the loaning of money to tenants who wanted to buy the farms of their own in cases where a reasonable price could be agreed with the landlord. So basically, the government subsidized the buying of these farms. So by 1910, 250,000 tenants had taken advantage of the measure. So you can see there's been a massive transfer of property to Catholic tenants. The problem is, to Catholic farmers, the problem is that's not going to be sufficient, because what the vast majority of people want is at least Home Rule, if not independence. The final strand of Irish nationalism that doesn't go away is the cultural strand, and you see this on slide 34 in what it was called at the time the Gaelic Revival. So this is the idea that this is the form of nationalism that is called cultural nationalism, in which the goal is to promote Irish identity, stressing the specificity of Irishness. So you get that in sport with the Gaelic Athletic Association, which promotes Gaelic sports. You see it in literature with the Irish Literary Society and the National Literary Society, which try to find common elements of Irish identity in legends and folklore and to make them into sort of the founding myths of Irishness. And finally, you see it in the promotion of the Gaelic League, the promotion of the Gaelic language. Okay? One of the reasons this cultural nationalism is developed is because of the frustrations of seeing the political nationalism hitting a brick wall. So, this brings me to the final slide, slide 35, and my conclusions. If we look at the Great Famine of 1845-1849, what do we see? We see that it ushered in Britain's liberal age. After the repeal of the Corn Laws, which were a symbol of mercantilism, free trade became the new economic common sense. But at the same time as that, the Irish question continued to haunt liberal Britain. Because in the 19th century, as I said, Britain was a champion of liberalism. It supported the liberal nationalist movements in Italy, in Greece, and in the Balkans, but never in Ireland. Britain was the champion of the rule of law, the champion of due process, but not in Ireland. By 1914, which is the end of the 19th century, the real end, the logical end of the 19th century is 1914. In 1914, a liberal government finally managed to pass a Home Rule Act. Despite the threats of civil war from Ulster Protestants, who feared that this would lead to independence. However, that act was never implemented because of the First World War. That brings me to the end of this lecture. On the very final slide, slide 36, you have a series of things that you can consult and read. I strongly encourage you to listen to the Radio 4 podcast that's at the end of this slide. I wish you all a very good continuation and look forward to narrating the third lecture very soon and posting it on Emetis.